Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the regular meeting of the Board of Estimate and Apportionment and the presentation of the fiscal year 2024 annual operating plan. The date of today's meeting is Wednesday, April 19th, 2023. Ms. Stephanie Green, please call the roll.
Mayor Jones,
Present.
Comptroller Green,
Here.
President Green,
Present.
all present.
Great. Items presented for the first time on our agenda. Item number 1, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of contracts and leases for various city departments as listed on Exhibit A. Item number 2, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of intra-departmental and interdepartmental transfers from various city departments as listed on Exhibit B. Item number 3, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval of transfers between projects for capital improvement funds as listed on Exhibit C. Item number 4, request from the Comptroller's Office for approval to add 9 full-time and 3 per-performance security guards to the Gateway Transportation Center Table of Organization. Item number 5, request from the Director of Health for approval to delete 2 public health nurse 2 positions from their Table of Organization and add them to the Department of Public Safety Office of Violence Prevention. Item number 6, request from the Department of Health for approval of to transfer funds appropriated in ordinances 71393 and 71555 regarding ARPA or American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 projects in the amount of $11,275,063.67 to the Department of Public Safety Office of Violence Prevention within Fund 1509 from Center 700012 to Center 619001. Item number 7, request from the Director of Public Safety for approval of board bill number to be determined. This ordinance authorizes the receipt and appropriation of SFY 23 American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, state and local recovery funds, SLFRF, county jail maintenance and improvement CJMI grant subaward from the state of Missouri Department of Public Safety in the amount of $1.1 million to fund new radios, repairs, and improvements at the City Justice Center. Item number 8, request from the Director of Airports for approval of board bill number to be determined. This ordinance authorizes a memorandum of agreement with Southwest Airlines Company for the expansion and improvements to Terminal 2 inbound and outbound baggage handling systems and facilities. And item number 9, request from the Community Development Administration Executive Director for the approval of the following changes to their Table of Organization. Delete 1 Executive Assistant position, delete 1 Community Development Supervisor position, add 2 Program Manager 2 positions, add 1 Administrative Assistant 2 position, add 1 Grants Manager position, add 4 Grant Administrator positions. And then after we finish this agenda, we will discuss the FY 2024 annual operating plan as presented by Paul Payne, our budget director. I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as offered.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor, please signify by voice vote of aye or nay. Ms. Stephanie Green, please call the roll.
Mayor Jones,
Aye.
Comptroller Green,
Aye.
President Green,
Aye.
all in favor.
Wonderful. And now I'll turn this over to Paul Payne to present fiscal year 2024 budget.
Thank you, Mayor and Madam President and Madam Comptroller. I'm going to share my screen. So let's see if we can pull this up. Has it been pulled? Can you see my the presentation on screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me get started on the slide, second slide here. The proposed annual operating plan for 2024 is a total of $1.32 billion, an increase of 7.1% over the previous fiscal year. And in the chart below that, you can see all the components of that budget, with the general fund being the largest share at $566.8 million. That's a 5% increase. And though that's a 5% increase, it's pretty much tracking with what we have in this year's revenue. And as I get further along the discussion, you're going to see that we're not anticipating much growth for next fiscal year. In the special revenue category of $233.4 million, that's a 6.2% increase, or $13.6 million. There's the two largest increases in that category would be the use tax fund, which is up by $7.1 million, as well as the Convention and Tourism Fund and Sports Authority Trust Fund. Those are funds generated from both hotel and restaurant taxes, which are still recovering this year from previous downturns. And so they put in a strong performance this year, as we're going to discuss in a moment. Other smaller fund increases you're going to see in some of the sales tax trust funds and such, or they are upper small, while they are outperforming this year, that's smaller amounts. And then the graduated business license fund, which is down slightly. In the grant fund categories, $80.3 million, that's an 8.2% decline. If you remember last year's budget, we had $19 million in ARPA funds that we had added. Well, of course, we're not doing that this year because all those funds have been appropriated. So that knocks our grant fund total down. But we also have some increases. Block grant monies are up $2.7 million, and the human services grants are up 12.4. So you've got some increases and declines offsetting that one-time ARPA appropriation from the prior year. In the debt service fund, typically that's $11.1 million. That's showing a big increase there. That was typically our GO debt, but I also noted that in the new system, that's a reclassification of some existing, what we called the trustee lease fund, that was for some lease payment debt as well. So that's not necessarily as much an increase, but a reclassification of a fund that was included in special revenue last year. In the capital improvement funds, the total is $42.2 million. That's a 12.8% increase, or $4.8 million. The notable items there is because the sales tax are outperforming this year, we do have a beginning balance of about $2.4 million in the various sales tax receipts. The capital funds are very sales tax dependent. So when the funds either increase or decline, that determines a lot by how much we have to budget for the next fiscal year. And then we also have the gas tax, which is increasing. As you recall, the state of Missouri and voters in the state approved a 5-year incremental graduated increase in the gas tax. We've had 2 of those so far. We're about to have our 3rd starting in July. And so we've got a budgeted $2.7 million increase, or $4.8 million in total for gas tax revenues, which will be used for road and bridge improvements in the capital fund. We did take a small hit, we did take a hit this year with the reallocation of those revenues, which are population based. So they incorporated that into the from the 2020 census. So our increase this year wasn't as great, but we should receive the full benefit next year. In the enterprise funds at $281 million, that's a 17% increase. Biggest increase there, airport is up $34 million, or a 20%. And water division is up $6.5 million and 9.6%. We'll discuss that a little bit more later in the presentation. And then the internal service funds, those are funds that we charge among departments, pay into a collective fund. It's $105.5 million, and it's 4.4% increase. Mostly that's for our health insurance, employee benefit funds, as well as our fuel account and such. And you can see what the chart below of those funds, the general fund remains the largest portion of all those funds at 43% of the budget. In terms of revenue, for how we've been doing in the current fiscal year through the 3rd quarter, we've seen most major tax revenues are on track or exceeding budget estimates. But we did see some signs of weakening in the 3rd quarter, particularly with the earnings and payroll tax. Although restaurant, hotels, as well as sales tax have remained strong. You look at the earnings tax year to date through the 3rd quarter was up 3.9%, and the payroll tax was up 6.7%. Now, the earnings tax is comprised of 2 pieces. You've got the individual payments, particularly the largest, which is withholding. So that's the 1%. And then you have a corporate piece that represents about 20% of that total. Well, the withholding was up about 5.9%. That's sort of closer to the payroll tax. But the corporate receipts were down 6.8. Now, the corporate receipts are mostly received in the fourth quarter, so that they're pretty volatile in the early going. As I mentioned, as you look at the bar charts, you can see some weakening in the trends in the third quarter, particularly with the payroll tax down 1.4%. So as I mentioned, as we look ahead, we are anticipating some slowdown in both of these two sources. In the sales tax, sales tax receipts have actually been pretty good, as well as the use tax, up 10.5% and 9.6% respectively. Now, sales tax historically is not a strong grower over the years, actually less than 2% per year. A 10-year growth rate for our sales tax is like 1.3. So you have to imagine that the fact that we're in an inflationary cycle is contributing to these returns. And same with the use tax has been more volatile over the years, but as more and more online sales has been taking place with the use tax receipts, is becoming to behave more and more like the sales tax as well. But what we're anticipating is that with a potential projected slowdown in the economy, and as well as a reduction in inflation, you're going to see those growth rates be reduced in the coming fiscal year. So it's going to be a combination of less inflation as well as a slower economy. So we're not projecting much in the way of growth for next fiscal year in the sales tax receipts. And finally, in the restaurant and hotel taxes, these two sources were the strongest hit from the pandemic. And if you look at the chart, you can see clearly where that was in fiscal 21, and then they bounced back strongly in fiscal 22, but did not return yet to their pre-pandemic levels. But I would say after this fiscal year, even on an inflation adjusted basis, the restaurant tax was up about 20% and the hotel tax was up 37%. Even on an inflation adjusted basis, they have returned pretty much to their pre-pandemic levels. And again, I would expect going forward, only modest growth going into FY24. So overall, this next chart basically shows what the general fund, as well as many of these major special revenue funds in total look like. And the two columns I wanted to point to is basically, if you look at the over under FY23, we are tracking over estimates current fiscal year, 27.4 million in the general fund, pending the fourth quarter results, which are still to come. And most of these other accounts are up because the sales tax are up. We have seen the gaming fund is trailing. That has been somewhat flat in the last fiscal year. We're not expecting much growth in the next fiscal year. But I should point out that in the FY24 estimate, you can see that we're not expecting growth at all in both the general fund and only modest growth in the sales tax funds. So this next slide starts with the general fund outlook. Starting with our beginning estimate for the current fiscal year, which was $540 million. Like I said, we were tracking over that by about $27 million, but we're not anticipating, looking forward to next year, any major sources of growth there. So we've actually got a small decline in revenue for next year. So that leaves us with $566.9 million as our general fund revenue estimate. So with that as our starting point, we look at the FY24 budget, and we started this year's budget with just, as I mentioned, $539.9 million. The biggest item, without a doubt, is the pay and benefits that we're allocating for employees next fiscal year. And the biggest of those would be the police and fire pay package, totaling about $18 million. Not all of that's general revenue, but the large part of it is. So the police pay matrix, education incentives. Now this excludes the pension piece, which we'll talk about later, but that's about an 8.8 to 13% matrix increases across the board for the police department. That's about 9.7 million in the general fund. Now, separate from that, we did get the request for police pensions, And this, again, this is separate from the pay package, but they're normal because of the decline in the market last year. Their pension costs were also going up about $700,000. With the fire department, it's the same 13% increases in matrix. Again, this does not include the pension piece of that when we'll talk about, and that was about $5 million in the general fund for that. And again, separate from the pay package, we do have some fire pension increases. Both FRS and FRP did see declines in the market last year. And then also FRP had an experience study which would reduce its assumed rate of return. So all of that contributed to an increase of 2.7 million in those two funds. And then for non-uniform regular employees, we had budgeted a 3% across the board, which in addition to their merit increase of 1.5%, which is awarded on their anniversary date of hire, they should be realizing a 4.5% increase next fiscal year. And then the pension piece associated with that, because of the decline in the market, was $2.3 million increase, and that's for the ERS system. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into pensions. But that's just under $25 million just related to pay and benefit increases, and by far the largest increase in the general fund budget. So aside from that, we do have some other changes within the departments, and starting with general government, the Board of Aldermen, obviously we have you got the reduced number of the aldermen, but we did have that full year's cost of the staffing that we had. We had a salary savings in this year's budget simply because there wasn't going to be a full year, but this will be the full year cost of those positions. And that's about a $900,000 increase. Mayor's office is about flat, about the same as this current fiscal year. Department of Personnel has a new deputy position that's approved this fiscal year, and they're up a few positions there as they try to help fill some of the number of vacancies that we have within city government. Information System Services, they've got a continued contract cost associated with the integration of the new accounting and payroll system, and then they cut a couple new positions there. The city councilor's up a couple positions. The big increase in the comptroller's office is the about a $2.3 million in the insurance premiums for our coverage on various city buildings that the city owns. Going into the next category, something we call non-departmental, that's our citywide accounts. These are not specific to other departments. Last year's budget, we had a one-time $5 million item there to address some one-time pay incentives. That's not repeated, so that's down 5. But then we got some other increases. We do contribute to asset preservation costs, which are basically capital maintenance costs, the convention center, and that gets a CPI adjustment every year, and that's a couple $100,000. And then we have some miscellaneous items in there, workers' comp for that's not specific to the large departments, unemployment comp, our internal auditing increases, as well as the state audit, which will be completed this fiscal year, should go down, and then we have some small increases in debt payments. So that all nets out at about a $400,000 increase there. In the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Forestry, we've got not big numbers there. Recreation's adding a couple of lifeguards to supplement their per performance, and that should give them some additional year-round coverage for their pools. Forestry is up a couple of positions, but they also are reducing their per performance. They're being supplemented by some payments for LRA and maintaining some of the weeds and debris around LRA-owned properties. Parks Division is up. That's mostly in supply accounts. And this isn't a big dollar amount, but Soulard Market is adding a full-time market manager as opposed to some of their per performance, which they've been using in the past. In the judicial offices, we see an increase in the circuit court. They included their pay within their budget as separate from the other regular employees. So that's a $1.1 million increase in addition to their some facility maintenance and other costs associated with those court offices. Circuit attorney is close to being flat. It's about the same number of positions there. Sheriff, the biggest increase there is that we do have a second year of a radio lease payment that they entered into, a radio lease purchase agreement, which they entered into this current fiscal year. City courts is seeing 3 new positions, one of them being a full-time judge to supplement the case load that they're managing. They are also in the process of transitioning to a state mandated state data system. I think that's called the Show Me Court system, which will be rolled out this coming fiscal year. And juvenile detention, similar to the circuit court, has got its pay and increases as well as other facility maintenance costs. In the county offices, the bigger numbers, election board, given that it's a non-election year, is down by about $700,000 net. And then we see an increase in the medical examiner's costs, which is being seen both in the caseloads of medical exams as well as the costs of them. And so they're up about a net $400,000. In the street department, and the director of streets, it's mostly, they're adding some, we added a deputy position to that director's office. And then they're also absorbing 4 telecom positions that were included in the towing division. So you see the towing division is down. It's just a switch from that position to others. In traffic and streets, most of those increases, they're related to supplies, particularly with maintaining traffic poles and wiring and the increased costs associated with that. And then street also has maintaining its costs for salt, snow chemicals and salt for maintaining that's being able to address winter storms and such like that. The biggest increase you're going to see in refuse is the increase in its fee disposal. We're going out for a new contract on disposal of municipal solid waste, and that's anticipated to be $11.5 million in total. That's a 45% increase, so $3.6 million. I've got part of that increase in the use tax fund related to bulky pickup, but that's a significant increase in the cost of waste disposal, driven primarily by by the discrepancies between the regular solid waste and recycled waste. That used to be a savings, and now it's costing more to dispose of waste in that form. So you're going to see a $3.6 million increase in the estimated cost of waste disposal in the refuse division. In public safety and police in particular, the biggest item, as I mentioned, was pay. These other adjustments, we've got some salary savings, attritions, and some fleet purchases, and then it shares other funds which increase and decrease depending on the sales tax and offset the general fund's costs. But other than pay, I would say the biggest increase you're going to see in the police department is a $2 million increase in their fleet purchases, which is also a continuation of the desire to get more take-home vehicles for officers, and that's in their budget. In the fire department, again, they have some of those other funds which offset some of the general fund costs, but again, their biggest item in their budget this year is also the pay increase that they've seen. They've got some other smaller increases in supplies and such, but the biggest item in there is going to be the pay increase. Other items in public safety, you've got the director, they've got some professional services item for about $100,000 doing some studies within the department. Big item here within all these is the Office of Violence Prevention. This will be the first full year in which that office has existed. That was created, and a number of other functions from both the health department and elsewhere in public safety have been consolidated into that. That budget is $2.5 million. And so that's not so much an increase as just an absorption of other functions from other departments. And then in the office and in the Department of Corrections, they have numerous vacancies within that department. They've been transferring funds for addressing some of their capital needs as well. This includes some continued salary savings in that office due to their vacancies. I think once the capital improvements are finished, then we'd be able to look at and see their full new staffing regimen to address what that TO should ultimately be. But for the moment, it's unchanged, and it has some salary savings in that budget. Director of Health, again, that's the $1.7 million for the Office of Violence Prevention that was consolidated in the current fiscal year. Human Services, mostly grant funded. It's just modest changes in the general fund budget. And the biggest items in the Board of Public Service would be Facilities Management and ESD, which is our Equipment Services Division, fleet costs, and Facilities Management. That's all our utility costs for all city buildings, and it's got an increase there. And in Equipment Services, they are contracting out their fleet, their repair, or their not only their repair costs, but they do have some contracting for their supply accounts previously held in-house, and those are all increases of about $1 million. So for BPS, that's about a $1.8 million net increase. So if you add up all those changes as a net increase of $27 million over this year's budget, you end up with a $566.8 million general fund budget, which is balanced with the projected revenue. In terms of the general fund revenue outlook, starting with the earnings tax, as I mentioned, it's budgeted at $207.8 million, but that's the actual decline for next year, anticipating that the economic slowdown, which is most people are projecting, or economists are looking at potentially in the third quarter of this calendar year. I'm expecting that's something that we can probably expect to see later in the fiscal 24. In the property tax category, it's $73.5 million. Property tax, that's going to be their got to estimate at their longer term growth rate. In an economic downturn, you usually don't see something in property tax until a couple of years down the road at least. And so I'm not expecting that to see a decline. But sales tax, that's going to be an interesting one to watch. Again, you've got competing factors there. You've got inflation, which is still high and tends to be inflating the growth rate in the sales tax. But then if you've got an economic slowdown that's occurring in the third quarter of the calendar year, those are going to be competing trends to see how that ends up. But I've got a 1% increase in for next year. Payroll tax, usually it's weaker than the earnings tax, and I've got a 3.6% decline, that just based on historical performance. Utility taxes have been increasing this year. A lot of it related to the natural gas tax or natural gas rate increases this year. But also contributing to that is the water division is going to be anticipating a rate increase. So its estimates are up as well in the franchise tax rate increase in that category. Intergovernmental receipts at $23.4 million. It's a 3.8% increase. Mostly, I think EMS was down, and I think they were estimated to be slightly up next year. Licenses at $13.9 million. It's pretty flat. Those are fixed rate fees that don't go up that much in a year. Departmental fees and fines, we at $59.2 million. That's a 2% decline. LRA was a big payment. We had a big payment in this year for forestry that was down in general revenue, actually, and that's the payment will be lower next year, so we do not expect that to repeat. And then other category, that's at $31.5 million. That's 10.9% increase. The big increase there in the other category, that's contributions from both the C&T fund as well as the Sports Facility Trust Fund. And again, as I mentioned, both hotel and restaurant taxes are outperforming this year, so we do expect to see an increase in being able to draw those funds in for next year's budget. And as the pie chart illustrates below, that's a $566.9 million in general revenue. Earnings tax remains the largest single source at 37% of that budget. And on the expenditure side, I'm not going to repeat everything I went through on here, but just for the highlights, again, on general government, the biggest increases there. You had the Board of Aldermen increase. It's had a smaller increase in the Department of Personnel at $40.6 million. It's an 8.7% increase. In the general finance, $14 million, that increase of 22.6%, generally driven by, again, the increase in insurance premium for coverage of the city buildings. Non-departmental, $34 million. That's a decrease of 11.6%. The biggest item there, that was that $5 million one-time payment, one-time allocation for pay incentives in the current year's budget. That's not repeated. Parks, Recreation, and Forestry, 23.7%. That's a 3%. That's just normal cost increases. Judicial offices, 58.1%, 5.6% increase. Again, that's the cost of both the pay as well as the maintenance costs of mostly the circuit courts, as well as the increase in the city courts. County offices, $10.7 million. That's a decrease of 0.7%. And you'll see a decline there in the election board, an increase again in medical examiner. Streets, 51.9%, 9.2% increase. The biggest increase you're going to see there is the increase in the refuse division and the cost of waste disposal. Public safety, $290.3 million. That's a 5.9% increase. Again, the largest increase you're going to see in both police and fire is for the pay packages of those two departments. Health and Human Services, $1.8 million. That was actually the move of the supportive entry and programs that were budgeted under health that are now part of the Office of Violence Prevention. So that's just a move of those costs rather than a decline. And Board of Public Service, 5.8% increase. That reflects the increases in both facilities management as well as the Equipment Services Division. In the special fund categories, the largest of the special funds, it's the local use tax. As I mentioned, this fiscal year through 10 months, we get April early, is up 9.6%. That's a revised estimate of $50.3 million, which is about $6 million over the current fiscal year. In the allocations, affordable housing, which is we're allocating 6.5 million going forward, but you also notice that it has the total budget 7.2 because it includes it had a mortgage payment, some mortgage payments that were paid in principal paid this fiscal year, which is able to appropriate, as well as some other payments, so which brought some reappropriations of existing previous appropriations that it had available to include in the budget. So in addition to the 6.5 million, it's got $700,000 in available balances. So that budget is up to $7.2 million, and that's the budget for next proposed for next fiscal year. The Healthcare Trust Fund by ordinance gets $5 million, and there are some changes there. We created the Director of Health created a behavioral health unit that is being moved into that trust fund. Last year was the final year in which that was typical. Those $5 million are typically paid for coverage in the healthcare, those who were not able to get into the Medicaid on the state level. This is sort of a health safety net. But given the expansion of Medicaid in the state of Missouri, the health director said these particular funds are no longer required for that original purpose. So we can use those funds for other healthcare purposes. So in this coming fiscal year, it includes both an expansion of the behavioral health unit as well as some other contractual services that will be available for healthcare, other healthcare purposes. And again, it remains the $5 million, which was appropriated by ordinance, but the potential use for those funds could change going forward. In building demolition, again, that's its usual allocation of $3 million by ordinance. Aside from those three sources, which are determined by formula, the excess use tax fund amounts to $41.6 million. And you can see the departments that receive those allocations. It funds $600,000 in the city councilor's affirmative litigation unit. A portion goes to the refuse division bulky pickup of $1.3 million. I should point out that's a $500,000 increase, which includes a portion of the estimated increase for the waste disposal contract. The building division housing conservation program is funded at $2.9 million. The police department is also funded a portion in that at $20 million. That's a $2.2 million increase. And here are those two portions of related to the pay package I mentioned earlier. Police and fire pension costs of $3.3 million. And I'll get this, and we'll discuss a little bit more on pensions, but pension costs are estimated based on the contributions or the status of the plan at the end of October. Given that we are increasing the pay going forward starting in July, we thought it best to allocate, and that is over and above whatever the assumed actuarial assumptions for those plans. We do anticipate that in the following year, we're going to see an increase in those pension costs. So what we're doing is setting aside funds to cover the increased costs associated with that pay package. And so that's kept separate from the regular the pension plan that was the pension budget that was included in the general fund. But that's what those numbers are in those dollar accounts that cover the estimated costs of those incremental costs related to the pension. The health department has a net increase of 10 new positions, and its budget is $11.8 million. And human services is pretty much flat at 1.7. So the total use tax fund is at $56.8 million. In the economic development sales tax fund, this is a budget that is allocated by ordinance and percentages. Again, since it's a sales tax, it also is up, follows the rest of the sales taxes in city government. revenues. It's up 10.5% through the first 10 months of this fiscal year. And we also are appropriating, as funds are not spent in the current fiscal year, we reappropriate balances. So there are some $8.2 million in existing balances. Now, if you're familiar with the Economic Development Sales Tax Fund, 60% of that goes for purposes of transit. And that is estimated at $14 million next year. And I should point out that at the end of FY23, it's projected that the balance in that transit account will be coming pretty close to $70 million, to $67.9 million. So if you add in the forward 18 for next year, you should be in excess of $80 million next year if without any spending from that account. And the other four accounts each receive 10% allocation. And as I mentioned, there are some reappropriation of existing balances, and neighborhood stabilization, primarily comprised of both PDA and community development agency budgets, 3.6 million and 2.6 million 2.7 million respectively. That's $6.3 million, including that $4 million balance. Workforce development, which includes Slate, which they're adding some positions to that office, and maintenance of the North Side office, which they established this fiscal year at $3.5 million, as well as some services from the Director of Human Services of $900,000. So that's a $4.4 million budget. And that again includes $2.1 million in unspent balances from the previous fiscal year. And the public safety infrastructure piece also gets 10%, and that's 4.5%. That's a $4.5 million budget, and it funds items such as the 911 increment, 0.400,000. The big item in public safety infrastructure this year, in addition to SEMA getting its usual $100,000 for its notification system, there's $3.9 million allocated for replacement of its existing siren warning system. So that's a new initiative, and it's provided for by funds within that public safety piece of the economic development sales tax. So that's a new initiative. So in total, SEMA will be receiving $4 million in that budget. And then 10% of the city infrastructure, 10% of the economic development sales tax funds, or $2.3 million, were being allocated to the capital fund, and those are appropriated in the capital budget. So that brings the total budget of the economic development sales tax fund to $31.5 million. Another major fund we have is the half-cent public safety sales and use tax, also known as Prop P. And there's two components to that. There's the sales tax increase that's associated with a half-cent sales tax, and then there's the use tax increase that went up with that when that sales tax was passed back in 2017. And each component of that has the ordinance allocates what proportion goes to what department. And so with the sales tax estimated at $23.3 million, and again, it has some beginning balances because sales taxes were outperforming this year. 66% of that goes to the police department. That budget will be $17 million. That includes $15.4 million of new revenue plus $1.6 million of balance. 28% is allocated to the fire department. That consists of $6.5 million in new funds plus $100,000 balance, which is $6.6 million. And then the circuit attorney gets 6.6% of that estimated revenue of $1.4 million. So that's $25.1 million from the sales tax piece. Under the use tax piece, estimated at $5.9 million, there are also $2.5 million of additional balances appropriated there. 25% of the revenues go to after-school programs and summer jobs, and that's comprised of a Director of Public Safety, which has a summer jobs piece estimated at $6.7 or $600,000, and the police cadet program of $700,000 for a $1.3 million budget. The circuit attorney gets 7.7% of those funds, which is reappropriated, also $500,000, and then it consists of $500,000 plus a reappropriation of $1 million balance of $1.5 million. And that's funds that Public Integrity Unit and Witness Protection Program that was funded for the first time last year. 25% of the monies go to recreation programs, which includes totals $1.5 million, which throwing in an additional existing balance of $400,000 brings that budget to $1.9 million. That includes per performance rec assistance, and you'll see that in their budget. 17.3% of the use tax revenue is allocated to the building division for building demolition, and that's estimated at $1 million plus unfunded balances of, or unappropriated balances of $500,000, which brings that budget to $1.5 million. And then 25% of the use tax is allocated to social work and mental health purposes. And you'll see that in the Department of Human Services. They also have a beginning balance of $600,000, bringing that total budget to $2.1 million. So that's a total allocation of $8.3 million in the use tax piece of the Prop P funds. And the next slide is discussing the proposed capital fund budget. As I mentioned, the capital fund is $42.2 million. It's an increase of $4.9 million over the current fiscal year, a 13% increase. The two bigger items here to take note of is you got a $2.4 million excess sales tax revenue that's being accrued and then reappropriated for next fiscal year. That's exceeding current year's estimates. Typically what we do with capital is, and we've had this before, if sales tax falls short, we don't change the capital budget. We just take that out of the subsequent fiscal year's appropriation. But if sales tax is in excess, then we add that to the subsequent fiscal year's budget. So that's what's going on here, is that we got $2.4 million excess sales tax appropriated. And then we have $2.7 million in increase in gas tax receipts that I mentioned earlier, and that's allocated to road and bridge capital improvements. And most of the other receipts are allocated for ordinance, and you can see in the pie chart there how those are allocated. We got $10.7 million for citywide debt. Other citywide appropriations total $6.4 million. The biggest chunk of that's going to be the road and bridge capital improvements from the gas tax. Engineering and administration, that's for the salaries and related costs associated with both parks and or streets and BPS to their costs associated with design and implementation of capital projects. Ward improvement projects, $11.6 million going up next year. That's a $700,000 increase over the current fiscal year. And the same as major and neighborhood parks at $9.2 million, also an increase of $700,000 over the previous fiscal year. Recreation center improvements, $700,000 approximately. It's about a $50,000 increase over the current fiscal year. And police department improvement of $2.3 million. That's up $200,000 of previous fiscal year in that allocation. These next couple of slides just address changes in total personnel personnel counts. In the general fund, we're up a net 28 positions. So that's comprised of a mix of increases and decreases. Board of Aldermen, you're going to see that decline because obviously the number of the aldermen went down by 14. But you can see some increases in other departments. And there's a mix. Information systems up by 2, city courts up by 3. Comptroller in microfilm are down net by 2, circuit courts up by 7, city courts up by 3, streets up by 3, and then you've got some of those changes. So you're going to see various increases and decreases scattered throughout the departments, but net it's up 28. In the special fund categories, you're going to see a decline of 6, and again, those are mixed. Use tax funds are up by 10. Some miscellaneous special funds were down by 3, or actually down, and then you got some parks funds, BJC Parks Fund that was down by 4. So you're going to see not any one particular department, but scattered throughout. Grant funds, you're going to see a net decline of 2. Big change in the enterprise funds, they're actually down by 18. That's water division is down by 1, but airport is reduced by 17 positions. And this is a historical chart. We have been creeping back up on the number of positions. We're still down from where we were 10 years ago in all funds by about a little over 70 positions, but they had been down significantly more. General funds still down where we were in FY14. The bigger increase you're going to see in the special funds, we've had some new special funds, and then we're down by grant funds. Okay, pension costs. I mentioned the increasing costs of pension. In all funds, we're seeing a total cost increase of about $11.4 million. And this includes the estimated costs associated with the pay package that I mentioned earlier. That's of $3.4 million. And you can see the table below. PRS budget, which is the Police retirement system up by 3.3 million at 43.4 million total, and FRS FRP, that's the fire retirement plans, up by $3.7 million to 18.7 million total, and ERS which is the regular employee totals of $4.4 million to 42.2 million total. So these are going to be rising, and if we take a look at the next slide. This I know this is somewhat of a busy slide. I include it every year, but it gives some useful information. Market values and actuarial values of the plan, as well as the unfunded liabilities. And what's key to point out here is that the funded ratios, we typically have been pretty well funded, although now we're taking some hits of last year's actuarial hit a hit on the market last year. Our actuarial values declined below 80%. So you can see ERS is at 76.9%. The FRS, which is a frozen plan, is pretty well funded at 93.5%. So you're not going to see an issue there. But FRP is at 77.6%, and police dip below 80 at 79%. But I should point out that on a market basis, they're lower than that. Because when you do the actuarial estimates, it takes some smoothing into account. So you're not taking the hit all in one year. But what market basis will tell you is that what's yet to be realized in the valuation of those systems. So when you see market rates the funded ratio on a market basis lower than actuarial basis, that means there's more losses to be recognized going forward. And you can see with the employee retirement system, it's at 67.7%. ERS or FRS is 85.7%. FRP is 67.1%, and police retirement is 72.0%. So that would suggest that there's other losses to be recognized in the years ahead. So it's something that without a market rebound, you're going to continue to see increases going forward. And total unfunded liabilities amount to about $561.7 million. ERS, particularly, we saw that increase. It's up over 17% of pay, and you can see the estimated cost per each active employee in the chart below. So it's something we talk about a lot when we discuss pay and trying to keep our pay competitive with other jurisdictions, but it's something that we can't afford to ignore the pension piece associated with that, because that's creeping up, and we need to keep that in mind when we talk about compensation for employees. Now, one area of good news we've had over the last several years is we've made some significant improvements in our status of funded reserves. Our reserve level on a cash basis at the end of at the beginning of this current fiscal year stood at $92.7 million, or 17.2% of the FY23 budget. Now, the GFOA has a best practice recommendation, and theirs is at 2 months of the general fund expenditures, which would be about 16.6%. So we just exceeded that this current fiscal year. So that's for the first time in I think ever that we were actually at the recommended minimum balance that GFOA recommends for that. And I did not put it on this chart, but I do expect us to maintain that in FY24 pending the positive results from the current fiscal year. So that is something that is an achievement that we've made over the last several years, and which is at least a bit of good news. And it's a challenge to, and it's important to keep that at that level, given any potential for sudden downturns or severe recessions. So finally, as to recap, the total FY24 budget, $1.32 billion, a 7.1% increase from the prior fiscal year. The general funds at just under $540 million, a 5% increase. And though exceeding revenues in the current fiscal year, we assume little to no growth going forward in FY24. Some of the budget highlights include $25.4 million all funds address pay and benefit increases. Of this total, $18.5 million in general fund pending passage of pay ordinances. Another $8 million over and above that for increase in pension costs. $3.9 million to SEMA and the Economic Development Sales Tax for a new siren warning system. $3.6 million increase in the refuse division for projected costs of waste disposal contract. $2.6 million for Office of Violence Prevention. That's consolidating department functions from other departments. $2.3 million in the increase in the comptroller's office for rising insurance premiums. And then increases in the facilities manager fleet of services of $1.8 million. Increase in the Board of Aldermen for the full year costs of their new staff. A $700,000 increase in affordable housing budget, incorporating some beginning balances in their office, and a $700,000 net decrease in the Board of Elections for their off election year. Capital budgets funded at $42.2 million, which is an increase of $4.9 million, mostly due to increase, in addition to the sales tax increases, but including the increase in the gas tax revenue. The budget is balanced, although we do anticipate a period of uncertainty for the economy looking forward. So certain special fund revenue has not been incorporated. We haven't incorporated any interest earnings from ARPA, which should be available, and the marijuana sales taxes, which we do anticipate to start coming in probably December of this fiscal year, which we have not incorporated yet, but they do remain available as backstop should we see a decline in our estimated revenues going forward. And that pretty much sums it up. And I will again open it up to any questions you may have, and stop sharing my screen, but leave it back up to you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions for Paul Payne?
I do have a couple.
Sure.
One, this is a little bit more in the weeds, but I got this question a couple of times after the storms on the weekend. With the new siren system that we're putting in place, will that be easier to hear if you're inside of a building?
I'll have to defer to the operations folks on that.
Does anybody
one.
know that?
Yeah, I know we've got it funded, and that's and I see Nancy there, but.
So the goal is that, yes, you will be able to have people hear it, and it will no longer be muffled, which is the other problem.
Okay.
So that is the goal.
Okay. And then this might also be a Nancy question too, but given the increases in payroll for the city, do we have any breakdowns of are we making strides toward addressing some of the disparities that were in the pay study? Or what is the movement in getting some of our city workers pay that is more comparable with some of the surrounding areas?
So the first groups that we've been working with are the groups that are unionized, or the classifications for those positions are covered by bargaining unit, by unions. And so in specific, what we've looked at is the particular classifications, what the rates are in the area, and what we're paying in positions where we have had very difficult time hiring people. So those have been the first ones. We're using the studies a little bit, but not as the major focus, because the study is already 4 or 5 years old, and the study didn't compare apples to apples. But John Understall, who works for the Department of Personnel, has been very meticulous and tenacious about going through the classifications and trying to increase pay in different departments. We are not, and in classifications, we are not finished with most of them. We're not finished with all the unionized employees at this time. And then I think depending on how the budget looks, besides the increase that Paul talked about across the board, we need to see what we can do for positions that aren't in that category, in those unionized categories, in the next fiscal year as we move forward. So.
Okay. And do we have any projections when we think we'll be done with all of the union negotiations?
So we hope to be done with those so that a compensation plan can be put into place to be added to Board Bill 1. So we're hoping for by we'd be able to introduce something May 15th or May 16th.
Okay.
And I'm just smiling because the unions asked me that this morning. Some of it's on them, so
Okay.
mutual.
All right, those are all my questions.
Great. Any other questions for Paul or any other staff who are here?
I have a comment. Paul, I just wanted to thank you for all the hard work you put into this year's budget. Thank your staff. And I noticed at the end, there was revenues that are considered backstop and not considered in this budget. And then could you say a word about any pending possible payouts that's also not part of the budget that have been made public regarding the earnings tax for stay-at-home work? Is that appropriate at this time? I mean, I just wanted to know in terms of the budgeting for any types of funds that we may have set aside or not set aside.
Okay, yeah, I think there's all sorts of contingencies you're going to have to be aware of so that we can address any potential downturn in either the economy or loss of revenue. So I think looking forward, as I mentioned, we're anticipating a decline both on the revenue side. If something would happen on your earnings and payroll taxes, I think what we've identified is what you need to do is, and what we have done is identify some potential sources that we could utilize to offset revenues, so we're not expending all our resources in anticipation in case there is a negative outcome on any particular source of revenue. And I think we've done that. And so I think we're well positioned to address whatever comes forward, but you never know what's going to happen. So you just try to project as best you can and just keep those options open. As I mentioned, there are a couple revenue sources that we have not appropriated. For instance, the ARPA interest monies, interest earnings from the RAM settlement interest, and then particular marijuana sales taxes. All of those which have not been incorporated in this budget.
Paul, is there a sunset on the Economic Development Sales Tax Fund or Prop P?
No.
Okay, any other questions for Paul or any other business to discuss for E&A?
I did want to say thank you, Madam Comptroller, who pointed out our staff work. I did want to give a shout out of sorts to my budget manager, Jane Sussman, in doing a lot of the work. We've been sort of short staffed this year and incorporating a lot of the changes from the accounting system, payroll system, budget system, and getting that all incorporated all at the same time. I think there's still some work to do in getting that done, but I did want to acknowledge that effort on her behalf and staff effort we put into getting this done. So I think that's thank you for that.
Yes, we also want to thank the comptroller and IT staff for last Friday was our first pay period with no paper stubs. So hopefully everybody has had a chance to access the system and access their pay stubs. So any other questions or comments? Again, thank you, Paul, for a very thorough presentation on next year's budget. We are pretty confident that we're going into fiscal year 24 in a good financial position. So yeah, any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. All those in favor say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you very much.